Wednesday, November 13th, 2019, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Kiely and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, the launch of Disney Plus, the Mouse's new streaming service. The entire Disney Vault, or close to it. It's all in one place online. And we'll talk about the launch's impact on streaming. Is it going to be a ripple or is it a giant wave? Also, we're going to talk about Deadspin, a mass exodus from there in the last week or so, after management told staffers to stick to sports. It was a site that had been really good at making people who didn't care about sports care about sports. We'll talk about what's next there. And an apology from the editors of the Daily Northwestern has journalists across the country in shock. We'll talk about what the staff there did and why professionals say the approach makes them worry about the future of journalism. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our half hour is up today, but we're going to start with the first day of the televised impeachment hearings in the House of Representatives. I've had them on my TV since early this morning. It's a three-ring circus, all the way that the national news media has been covering this. And how it goes forward really is going to matter. My question for each of you, if you had one piece of advice as the day's testimony comes to an end and the punditry starts, what would that piece of advice be?
Ratchet it back. I mean, I think overkill is the worst thing that could happen here.
So maybe Wolf Blitzer didn't need to be on TV at 7 o'clock this morning?
Maybe
2 hours before
maybe
everything
not.
even
I
happened?
think, well, one of the things that I think is offensive about this is the commodification of a national crisis. So you see a lot of the cable television channels have these special graphics that they've developed. I mean, you'd think it was the Super Bowl that, you know, that was being promoted here. And I think that kind of packaging and overproduction really makes people feel manipulated, you know, and they are being manipulated. People are trying to amp up this event to catch eyeballs, to get more people viewing things. And is this the most important thing happening in the country as far as most Americans are concerned? I don't think for everybody. You know, I think a lot of people are worried about pocketbook issues. They're worried about other things that aren't getting covered because we're on the 39 millionth installment of the reality TV show that is Donald Trump. And I think there's going to be some fatigue setting in.
I think that fatigue has already set in. I mean, you know, this has been hyped ever since even back during the closed testimony and in the depositions, everybody was saying, well, I'll put it this way, I wouldn't say everyone, but all the Washington pundits were basically saying, but wait, because there's more. When the open hearings start, then we're really going to find out something. And I think it was, to me, it was just so overhyped that most people have sort of tuned it out. I mean, I think you're right. It's the reality show that, as you said, that is the Trump administration, is really starting to wane on people, and they're sort of like, hey, I've got other things to do. I don't have time to spend watching.
Well, so let me ask you this, and I'm going to ask this as someone who really doesn't have the memory of what happened during the Clinton impeachment.
Oh, you baby.
I know, I'm sorry. Obviously not of the Nixon. That one was well before I was even a glimmer in anybody's eye. But how much of that and the differences in the latest episode of the reality show is because of the way cable news is now, the way social media is now? I think of, you talked about the graphics packages. Graphics packages became this big thing with the crawls after 9/11, with this idea of continuously providing people with news updates that if they didn't have something on the screen at all times, people were going to feel like they were missing out on something. Help me remember, was it this way?
No, it was not this way. I remember, and I was a child at the time, but Nixon. Okay. I remember Nixon. Yes, Nixon. I remember watching the Watergate hearings with my grandmother because one of my childhood idols, Barbara Jordan, was she was the leader of the investigation during that time. in the House of Representatives.
And those felt as though there was gravity to it, not reality show.
Well, I think a big difference was, well, yes, it was wall-to-wall coverage. I mean, it got a lot of coverage, but I think, but it wasn't this pre-packaged, pre-hyped kind of thing. And I mean, the other thing, which has less to do with the media coverage than the political reality, is it was far more bipartisan.
Yes.
And so I think that was a big difference, and that's what lent it that sense of gravitas that more recent episodes have not had. But I mean, I think you've really touched, Amy, on something that is at the heart of this. There's all this kind of way we have of writing about these events, and we use a language that really isn't true. We say, oh, this is historic. Well, I'm dating myself here, but there have been 3 impeachments in my lifetime.
Right.
It's so it's really not that much that unusual anymore, which is a sad thing about our politics. I mean, but there you have it.
Yeah, and you have the difference in the way in which we cover it. And I would say when you had 3 networks that were covering Watergate, when you had during the Clinton era, you had more networks, but you didn't have this weaponization that is now social media and is now cable news that you now have. I mean, it is not really about, are we trying to get to some sort of truth? It's all about whose argument is the one that's going to persuade the American people, as if that's more important than whether or not the president actually either committed some sort of crime or did something that shouldn't have been done that leads to an impeachable defense. I mean, we aren't even talking about that anymore. We're talking about quid pro quo and all these other things, and whether or not the whistleblower should be named. Nothing. I mean, we're getting very little about did he actually commit some sort of act that is impeachable?
Now I'm afraid to ask the question, you see, because Facebook and YouTube said that they're banning any posts which name the person who is said to be the whistleblower in this case. For weeks and months almost, the national media has gone out of its way to be really cautious about identifying that person. The New York Times published a piece with information about their background and their credentials, but stopped just short of naming them. All of those efforts to protect the person thrown out the window when a guest on Fox News named names almost in passing. Lars Larson is a Portland, Oregon-based radio host. KGW-TV caught up with him and asked him why he did it.
I think it's important in a case where we're literally considering the removal of an American president.
Although he has no firsthand knowledge, Larson publicly identified who he believes is the whistleblower, connected to President Trump's dealings with Ukraine.
People will say this is reckless and dangerous.
How? How is it reckless and dangerous to name the person who's accusing the President of the United States of high crimes and misdemeanors?
Well, my first reaction is to shrug it off. This is Lars Larson. After all, we know him as the clown prince of distraction.
Political analyst Len Bergstein calls Larson's decision to out the suspected whistleblower a fundamental disservice to our democracy.
And the reason the whistleblower statutes were set up was so that someone could come forward with the truth and know that they would be protected. If, in fact, what a Lars Larson can do in this case is say, oh no, if you come forward, you're fair game, and we're going to make your life miserable, that will have a chilling effect on anybody, I think, coming forward.
I named the whistleblower today.
Lars Larson sees it differently and believes the person who may take down the president needs to be named.
And I believe that all of official Washington knows, all of the press corps in Washington knows, and the only people who are being kept in the dark are the American people. And if you're talking about removing the president that was chosen by the American people, you have an obligation to tell them who's accusing.
So does his argument hold any water with you?
Well, the first thing I would say is the classic question that we tell journalism students to ask, which is, how do you know that?
Well,
I mean,
and he
how
did.
How does Lars know this?
And
so
the
I kind
reporter
of
did ask, and he said, you know, he actually did this without personally verifying the identity. It's not like he had sources from Capitol Hill from 2,000 miles away. That was his answer.
So my response is, so what? I mean, you know, I could name a million names here, but it doesn't mean anything. That's number one. Number two, who the person is is far less significant than whether or not that person's brief checks out. And the person who initially blew the whistle didn't accuse the president of high crimes and misdemeanors. He just said something happened here that was very wrong, and I need to report it to a higher up, and that was done. So it's up to those higher ups and ultimately the representatives of the people, the U.S. Congress, to decide whether or not what that person reported is worth impeaching the president. So I think focusing on the identity of the whistleblower is it's a kind of a canard. It doesn't really mean anything, and besides, Lars Larson doesn't know who the guy is. He has no independent reporting.
I mean, to me, what this is, and you're seeing it with the whistleblower. You're seeing it with those who have testified behind closed doors to the House committee. Those who are going to testify, or who are in the process of testifying now in the open hearings. The playbook is to attack those who are presenting information, answering questions from the House committee. And it's not about what they say. It's not about the information they're providing. It's about attacking their credibility, attacking them personally. And this is basically what it is. So it's sort of, if we can name who this person is, then we can start attacking their credibility and attacking them personally. And that's basically what this is. So this whole thing about we're presenting this so the American people can know, as Kathy said, it's more about what did that person say. That's more important than who said it.
Okay, so let's change gears a little bit. So most companies have policies that if you break them during your term of employment, you can expect to be fired. But what about being fired for something you did while working somewhere else that's connected to an incident that happened at that previous job? CBS fired the staffer suspected of leaking that video that came out last week of ABC's Amy Rohrbach talking about the network spiking her Jeffrey Epstein story. You work in this business long enough, you talk to enough reporters, everybody is going to have one of these stories where they say, oh, my editors, they don't know what they're doing. They spiked my story. Got caught on tape and somebody else let it out there. Did she deserve to? Did the woman at CBS deserve to get fired for doing that?
Well, I think that's CBS's decision. I think probably what CBS's thought was is this is a person. I think we all have conversations in newsrooms that we expect to be confidential. Because we're working with news, it's a competitive environment. Sometimes it's because we don't want the competition to know. Sometimes it's a sensitive story. Just like any investigator, we don't want the sources of or the subjects of our investigation to know about it until we're ready. And sometimes it's other sensitive material. So I think if CBS thinks, well, if this person did it to ABC, she might do it to us. And CBS is a private company. You know, they have the right to do what they want. And I think there are a lot of media organizations that would discipline and have disciplined reporters for doing something similar. Yeah,
and I think in today's environment, you know, you only get one opportunity to actually mess up.
Yeah.
And then you're fired. I mean, I'm sure this has probably happened in the past where someone was probably suspended for a couple of days to think about your actions and whether or not you should be doing these kinds of things. I don't mean to chuckle.
I hear that and I think of a parents putting their kid in timeout.
Yeah, well,
go think about your actions.
Yeah, go think about your actions. And now it's like, okay, no, you're gone. But you know, to me, what's happening here is that, and this has happened throughout, where you have news organizations that are not sure whether or not the information that they're going to put out there is airtight, and so they're not going to go with it. And then they find out later, whoa, wait a minute, we did have the story, but you know, we just didn't feel comfortable. That happens every day, all dead news organizations.
And given how many times we've seen news organizations step in it, it's sometimes better to be on that side of it, maybe.
Yeah, it is.
You don't want to get beat, you don't want to get scooped, but maybe it's just me because I am very much I'm very risk averse.
Well, the other factor here is this leak went to Project Veritas, am I correct?
True, yes.
And that, I think, is another thing. This is an organization, or it's run by a guy who is actively targeting the media and actively trying to undermine reporters and the media. And if you are in the media, the idea that somebody in your newsroom, a trusted colleague, aided and abetted somebody who's going after the media would not be a comfortable thing to live with. So you need to trust your colleagues in a newsroom like you do in any workplace. And breaching that trust, I think, puts you in legitimate trouble.
Okay. So Monday, editors of the Daily Northwestern, the student newspaper independent of the School of Journalism at Northwestern University, published a piece on its website addressing the Daily's coverage of Attorney General Jeffrey Sessions, being on campus and there being protests around it. In this apology, 8 editors signed off on a piece explaining how they recognize that perhaps they went over the line in their coverage of that speech on campus. They said they were wrong to look up phone numbers in a student directory and call people or texting them looking for quotes. They said they were wrong for taking photos of people on public streets, holding those protests. They were apologizing basically for what I would describe as reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the apology and the way in which it was set up and what they're apologizing for, I don't think that was necessary. What bothers me about this is that the attacks from professional journalists on the apology and what they're apologizing for and that sort of thing, and not recognizing that we're talking about student reporters here.
We are.
And we're talking about a campus newspaper that, as you said, is not connected to the journalism school, and oftentimes the supervisors of those newspapers are way hands-off.
They are.
Hands-off.
That they're perhaps there to manage business aspects and make sure that money gets handled appropriately, policies are met, that type of thing.
Absolutely. And for people for journalists to come out and attack them, that I have a problem with, because you can criticize, but you don't have to do the trolling type of criticism that I saw yesterday when I was looking at this. And you can be more constructive in your criticism and say, hey, wait a minute, if you're doing this, then think about this part of it or that part of it, but apologizing may be going too far. And then the other part of this is that the fact that the editor of this of the newspaper who basically took responsibility for it as an African American, and for some African American journalists to say, well, the fact that he is black gives him comes at it from a different perspective. That is true. That is true. He does come at it from a different perspective, but I'm not sure whether or not the journalistic norms that they practice and then apologize for, whether or not there was some sort of violation of that. I don't think his race and ethnicity has much to do with that part of it as it does in his connection to the students who were protesting.
I think one of the things that it's been really interesting to talk about this with students this week.
What have our students been saying about this? I mainly teach online students now, so I don't have that same level of discourse right now.
I talked to some students and I said, why do you think Northwestern's students, the students at the Daily Northwestern, issued this apology? What do you think prompted it? And what a lot of students think is happening, and I suspect is true too, social media. The students at the paper, the reporters and the editor, were under such pressure after covering these protests that they kids get trolled on social media. And I first encountered this a couple of years ago when I was working with students at my college newspaper as a trustee of that paper. And my first reaction was to say, well, ignore what they say about you on Facebook. But I realized for that generation, it would be this equivalent of if somebody came in and sat in our living rooms and started hollering things and wouldn't go away. So I think this is something we really have to work with young journalists about. I suspect there was a lot of peer pressure on this editor and on his colleagues. And possibly because he is African American, he was made to feel somehow that he had betrayed some cause.
I agree with that.
And so I think this is an example of how the media landscape has changed for young journalists, and we really need to be aware of how to prepare them for that. I think we've all had experiences as journalists of having people we like get angry with us, and that's part of the job, right? But I think it's so amplified when it's on social media. So this is a form of bullying, really.
And so the apology was really a way of making it stop.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
Or at least
I'm just surmising, but that's my guess.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the other thing too is because we're seeing it more and more in terms of the protests, is that protesters are pushing back on journalists when they don't like the coverage or the way in which they're depicted.
Well,
but
that's
if you're
because they see it working for people who have big famous names.
Right. But to me, I mean, part of this is that if you're going to be out there in the public protesting, then there are certain consequences to that can be both positive and negative. And I do think that you're right. We, those of us who are teaching the current generation and the next generation of journalists, need to get them to understand that you're trying to present the whole story in its authenticity, the good as well as the bad, and you're going to get pushback from all sides on how that coverage, how people are perceived in that coverage, and you have to be able to understand that's where it's coming from and be able to deal with it.
I will say this much, in some of the threads that I was following, because of the number of former colleagues I have who still work in the Chicago media and Northwestern's proximity, there was one thread where there were Los Angeles Times stories that were shared, and the people in these threads were specifically pointing to what happened on our campus in 2015 and how our students handled some of those same types of issues. And I don't want to say, hey, look, we're better than, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying what happened here and how some of those conversations that were had here are still being looked at. There was another case similar to that that happened not in 2015. It was 3-4 weeks ago at Harvard.
Yeah, and I thought that was a good object lesson of the alternative way to handle that. So the Harvard Crimson came under fire from its own community. In fact, the Harvard student government passed some sort of a censure resolution against the student newspaper because they covered some protests against the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, and then called ICE, the agency, for comment. And the people who oppose ICE were just outraged by this. Well, the Harvard Crimson wrote an editorial, and I highly recommend it to our listeners. We've put it on our blog, that really explained what journalists do. And I think we in the profession need to do more of that. I think one of the reasons you saw so many grown-up journalists piling on this kid editor is that
I like that
journalists...
grown-up. My favorite is always when we say adults in Earnest, because who said they were adults?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm just saying grown-up. They're tall, right?
Right. Okay,
but
the taller
they're tall and old.
Yeah.
The taller and older journalists.
Yes.
But they really pushing, and I think the reason you saw that flare up is journalism is under attack.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're under attack from every quarter. We usually, I mean, we all know from the beginning, we've all known that you don't get into this business to win popularity contests, but we're so under attack and so under threat in many ways that I think people are just hyper vigilant, a little PTSD, and so, but I think taking those moments and turning them into teachable moments and letting the public know this is what we do, this is why we do it. And I thought the students at the Harvard Crimson did a terrific job with that editorial.
Right.
Okay, so yesterday morning it launched, Disney Plus. It's the newest offering in the world of online streaming, and it has opened up the Disney Vault to a whole lot of Disney fans, people staying up all night to see that trove of content, including a last-minute edition of most of Ernest's favorites, the Marvel movies. I know you've said to me for years there's no time for more shows, But what about being able to have that access to that whole Marvel library on Disney Plus? You
well, I
signing
mean,
up?
that part I don't know yet.
Okay.
I haven't found the time to check it out. But I mean, this is one of those instances where Disney saw an opportunity. It grabbed Star Wars first, and then it grabbed.
That's your other favorite.
Yeah, it's my other favorite.
Yeah.
And then they grabbed Marvel. And now, I mean, there are people going to go like, wait a minute, this might be worth investing in. This might be worth paying what, $4, $5, whatever the introductory fee is.
I think I saw one too that there's one where you can get it for like $12.99, and it's Disney Plus, the ESPN app access or whatever, and Hulu with commercials.
This might be worth it. I mean,
yeah.
they're going after Netflix. I mean, that's literally what they're doing. And to have all of this content, including all of the Disney movies, the old Disney, Bambi, you know, all of those movies.
I think I heard that like Dumbo is on there without any kind of edits.
Absolutely.
To it.
So I mean, they're not only reaching the older fans, but they're also reaching the younger ones. I mean, and it's that I think that this is a possibility. What it does to streaming services, I have no idea, but one of the things that people are going to have choices, and they're going to have to make a choice. Do I stick with Netflix or do I go with Disney?
And I also wonder, though, too, and Kathy, maybe you have a thought on this, when Disney gets into the game and begins to pull all of its content, like all the Marvel movies that are on Netflix are going to eventually disappear from there.
Right.
They're not going to continue to give the rights to Netflix. How is Disney Plus and soon to be NBC Universal's new streaming platform, Peacock, do they have the potential to really cannibalize the existing platforms that are out there?
Yeah, well, I just want to say one thing here.
Yeah.
This was released the same week as the impeachment hearings. Coincidence? I mean, what are you going to be watching?
Right.
So I do think in some ways
Dumbo?
it gives people more, well, you said it.
Sorry.
In some ways it gives people more choices.
Yeah.
In other ways, you know, I think this is potentially less convenient for consumers because of the decision making that you have to make and weighing, do I want this content? Well, if I drop that provider, I miss this other content. So, you know, I don't know about you, but I think TV has become really complicated.
Oh, absolutely.
It's as hard as doing your taxes to sit down and try to decide what you want,
Yeah.
where you're going to get it. If there's only one show that you like on Hulu, is it worth paying for it all year to wait for the next season of The Handmaid's Tale?
Yeah, so in other words, all of this choice, I think, has, in fact, it may, in fact, prove limiting for consumers. So, you know, there's all this candy in the store, but you can't eat all of it.
You can't eat all of it. No,
and
you're right.
You have to pick one.
Right.
So I don't know. You know, we'll see where this goes, but clearly, it's a huge change for media and entertainment media and how we consume.
And then I think eventually, you know, you wind up in these situations where, you know, you're going to have certain players who are going to corner the market, and then all of a sudden, the prices is going to go up. I mean, we saw that with cable. That happened with cable. That happened. I think it has the potential to happen with the streaming services, and then you start having these calls for regulation involved. So, if this plays out the way other things has played out, it's going to be really interesting to see. But you're right. I mean, you have choice now, but that choice may be limited in one way or another. Either you're going to limit it, or
by making the choice, you're putting limits on it.
Absolutely.
And as cable prices go up, they're trying to go after the cord cutters. So this becomes the way of getting the subscription fees that they weren't getting as people cut the cord.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that music means we're out of time, and we didn't get to talk about Deadspin yet. So you can go to our links blog at kbia.org to learn more about what happened there and get a better understanding. You can read more about all of the topics we talked about there. It's under both the programs and podcasts tabs at kbia.org. You can also find or listen to this program there again. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. The handle on Twitter is @views-on-KBIA. I'd like to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll see you again next week for another edition of Views of the News.